It was number 9.
You're on.
Good morning!
Good morning.
How's everyone doing?
We're good.
We survived our first quiz.
Yes.
We survived our first chapter.
Yes.
We entered our education hours from last time. I know some of you didn't. It will happen. I will email you again. Remember, 3.5 education hours for every class you attend in person or you watch the recording. Like we need your hours. It's really, really helpful, and we're also just trying to get you in the habit of like doing that, because again, that's how we advocate for the program, right? Like that's how we get all the cool stuff we have. So, how are we all feeling about botany? Nervous?
Good. It was educational for me.
Yeah. It was what?
Very educational.
Nice.
I learned a few things.
Yeah.
I thought I did. I thought I knew some things.
That's basically my experience with that. It's like I thought I knew. Cool. So botany is a lot, and we all think botany is a lot. And botanists show up every once in a while, and you'll find that for the most part they're a little apologetic about what they've done to the rest of us in terms of terms and everything else like that. But what we're really going to try and hit on today, and I want you guys to kind of remember throughout all of this, is that it's helpful for you to know some botanical terms. Absolutely. Like alternate versus opposite in leaf arrangement, that's very, very helpful. It's diagnostic for a lot of things. There are a lot of other botanical terms that we're really trying to get you to think about, because what we're trying to get you to do is to notice detail, right? Because so much of understanding plants, being able to identify plants, being able to even probably guess about what they need to grow without knowing what they are, is understanding the detail of what they are, right? And so being able to look at flowers and being able to look and say, oh, this has a really tender leaf versus this has a really kind of thick, waxy leaf, right? Those plants probably have different growth requirements, right? The tender, waxy one might be something like a cactus or a succulent, whereas the tough waxy one might be that, whereas the tender one might be, a lettuce, right? We grow lettuce and cactus differently. So all of that's to say that if this is a little bit overwhelming, that's very normal. If I have to look up botanical terms, there are some of them I know off the top of my head. There's a whole host of them that I'm like, gotta look that up every time, right? So this is a really, really great reference text if you want to learn more botany, if you kind of just want to go through some of this. Again, I think that learning botanical terms is like a fun party trick, but I really think that the value of this is the detail that you'll start noticing, and it makes the garden a lot of fun actually. You start seeing all of these tiny structures that you never saw before, and just kind of start seeing all of this information. So, great reference, kind of fun, interesting to look through. I'm not sure you will actually get botany in a day, but it's at least it's a little bit easier than kind of all of botany. So today what we're going to do is we are going to start, for the first part of class, we're going to do kind of a lecture overview of the chapter with a little bit of new information, a little bit of my spin, but for some of these early chapters we stick a little bit closer to the book just because there was a lot of info there and we want to make sure that you kind of get it. And then we'll have our snack, and then we will do activity stations where we'll be kind of practicing with some of these terms and looking at some plant samples and kind of trying to get some of this, in our hands and in our minds. And then finally we'll finish up with talking a little bit more about the initial training project, just to kind of start getting you guys oriented to that. Does that all sound good? Game plan? Awesome. Okay, cool. Botany. So this is a talk that was adapted from Charlotte Glenn. Charlotte Glenn is our state coordinator. So I'll start introducing you kind of to some of this state structure too. So I'm a county agent, and I help with the Master Gardener program. Charlotte is the person over in Raleigh at NC State who oversees basically all the county programs. And so she's kind of like, she's not my boss, but she's certainly a level above me, right? And so she's really wonderful, really helpful. She helps host plant pests and pathogens, which if you guys start attending those, you'll see Charlotte. She is a deep knowledge of plants and like how to grow plants. It's really amazing. She was a county agent for 17 years before she moved into this position, and she's really phenomenal and like really nice to work with. Okay, so before we start, and this is me being kind of an evolutionary biologist at heart, I really wanted to take a minute to orient us to what we're even looking at. So these are kind of the different major groups of life, right? Animals, that's us. We're not fish, but we are animals. Fungi, and plants. And what I want you to take from this is these are some of the more kind of like what we consider ancestral things, bacteria, and archaea. And plants and animals are totally separate evolutionary origins. We are separate origins of multicellularity, right? That means that like there were single-celled organisms over here, became plants, single-celled organisms over here that became animals. The reason that's really helpful to know, I think, is it means that the way that our bodies are organized, the way that we grow, the way that we do everything that is multicellularity is different between plants and animals, right? There are some similarities, just based on like cells, but they have different hormones, they have different ways of organizing their bodies, they have different ways of growing, right? And so a lot of the logic that we've developed as animals doesn't exactly translate to plants. So two of the, the biggest distinction I really think of is that in animals, when we are hurt, a lot of times we can have other cells that rush in to help, we can have other things that rush in, like if I get a cut, right, I can heal that, I can grow that tissue back, right, I can do that. Plants do not have cell movement. The way they add cells is they can, if they have a cell here, right, well, I'll draw it. If they have a cell here, right, and remember their cells are a little bit square, if you remember that from biology, they can add to the end, and if there's nothing here, they can add here. They cannot add a cell here now. Can't do it, right? And so why that becomes important is that plants don't heal the same way we do. They more like seal off wounds. And so they've put a lot of energy in figuring out how do you seal things because they can't just move tissue in there to fix it the way we would, right? All I'm really trying to orient you to is like animal logic often does not make sense for what plants are doing. And we are all very steeped in animal logic because we're animals, right? Plants are different. So that's kind of your background. So overview, what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover a little bit of taxonomy, so plant classification systems, anatomy, so plant structures and their functions, and then finally we're going to finish out with physiology, which is like how do plants go about being plants, right? You'll never be done with evolution. Okay, so when we think about the evolution of plants, first you have this kind of common green algae ancestor, and then you have a lineage that arises called the caryophytes, right? So a group of, from the algae come the caryophytes. Doesn't super matter what the caryophytes are up to, right? What starts happening that's important is that all of these organisms exist in the water, right? And then plants start figuring out embryo protection, right? So how do you actually protect your embryos with kind of like multi-cell structures? Once you have a little bit of protection, you don't have to be in water all the time, right? Because you're not going to dry out quite the same way. So then we start getting the bryophytes. Oh, that's a terrible picture. Sorry. Looks good on the screen. We'll talk more about them. You'll see actual pictures. So the bryophytes are going to be the mosses, lungworts, these kind of things, right, that we see that look kind of strange and low. Then you develop a vascular system, right? So in your book you read about the xylem and the phloem, right? So that allows you to actually transport nutrients, water, and everything from one cell to another more efficiently so you can start getting tall. Right? That's when you start getting the vascular, non-seeded plants. No. Note to self. Change pictures. Okay. Got it. So, okay. So this is going to be things like horsetails, a lot of other plants that we still consider primitive. We'll talk about those in a second. And then finally you get seeds. And this is a big deal. Seeds are a huge innovation because all of a sudden now that embryo is really protected. There's some really interesting stuff going on with actually how plants are growing their bodies, how they're growing the next generation. You get gymnosperms, and then ultimately you get flowers and fruit, and you get angiosperms. Right? So we're going to spend the first little bit of this time talking about some of these earlier plants, though. So the non-vascular plants, mosses, liverworts. Liverworts are really fascinating and really cool. A lot of times you'll see them almost as like the weird scummy stuff that happens around plants that are watered too much. But they're really interesting and they're really wild. These things lack a vascular system, so they have to stay very low to the ground. Occasionally they can throw out a little bit more height, but again, they have to stay low because they just don't have any sort of internal structure to transport nutrients, water, give support, anything like that. And so oftentimes we do call these things primitive. This is a term that you will hear used, so I want you to hear it. But again, from an evolutionary perspective, any moss that you see right now has been evolving for the same amount of time as any flower that you see right now. Right? They've both been on the planet a very long time. Right? Like, it's not that mosses showed up however many millions of years ago and then stopped evolving. Right? They continued all of that evolution. They just stayed kind of on a system that worked for them. Some of the vascular non-seed-bearing plants, this is going to be things like ferns, club mosses, horsetails. You might also think of that as equisetum. We have some examples of fern leaves over there. These are really interesting. They have spores instead of seeds. Spores are great because they are protected, right? So the embryo is protected and you can get out of the water a little bit. But it has to land in just the right conditions, right? It has to kind of have everything going just right because it packs no food. It is just the baby plant. There's no food for the baby plant to eat, which is kind of more like what a seed is. So after some of these vascular non-seed bearing plants, that's when we have this huge innovation, right? We have the vascular tissue evolving. So the xylem transports water and nutrients, typically from roots to leaves. But I think of xylem as being a little bit more water transport, right? That's really what we're thinking about with xylem. We're thinking about water transport. Whereas the phloem transports sugars from leaves to the rest of the plant. So I think of phloem food, I don't know. That's just kind of how I remember it. But it's all that nutrients happening. And so this is really where you have photosynthesis happening out in the leaves, and you have all those photosynthetic products like the sugars, the carbohydrates, right? Everything that's going to power the plant. And that's how you're actually moving it out from the leaves to everything else. This really allows plants to get bigger, more specialized, have more specialized structures to evolve into any number of different shapes because all of a sudden they're not limited to a tiny little moss, right? Now they can grow big, they can do all sorts of interesting stuff. This also means that now they have to have hormones to communicate, right? Because if all the tissues aren't right next to each other, kind of in the same soup like you would have on a moss or a liverwort, you got to be able to communicate between the tip of this branch and the tip of this root, right? So now you need hormones to communicate. So the plant hormones are helpful to know that they exist. You don't need to memorize that an auxin is, helps with apical dominance, right? That it helps the tip of the plant kind of suppress growth throughout some of the other areas. What's helpful to know is that plant hormones exist, and you can always look them up, right? Remember, a lot of what I'm teaching you is going to be like, I need you to know this exists, and you can look it up if you have a question about it. And a lot of times the plant hormones are how herbicides are working. Most herbicides are working by getting into the vascular system, by disrupting a hormone, by doing something where they're kind of, causing something in the plant to misfire that kills the plant. So the gibberellins break seed and bud dormancy and they promote growth. So for seeds and buds, you don't want to drop a seed or make a bud and have it just start growing right away. You want to have it do it at the right time in response to environmental conditions. The gibberellins help with that. Cytokinins promote cell division, prevent senescence, so prevent cells from dying and kind of going dormant. Ethylene is involved in fruit ripening and abscission. So this is kind of like the old trick of putting a ripe banana next to whatever other piece of fruit you're trying to get to ripen? It's because the ripe banana is giving off so much ethylene that it helps even ripen the other fruit with it. So they're also involved in abscission. What we're talking about with abscission, that is like when the leaves start falling off the plant in a planned way, right? So like in the fall, when all the leaves are falling, ethylene is going to help with some of those to get the leaves to fall off, right? Because think about it, there's all these things, right? You make a seed, you want it to germinate at the right time. Make a bud, you want it to break at the right time. like open at the right time. If you make a leaf that is supposed to drop, you want it to drop at the right time, right? You don't want to make a leaf and then have it drop in the spring. You want it to hold on to the fall, and so all of that is signaling that gets that to happen.
So I haven't seen anything about this, but can you use gibberellins to help, like, instead of stratification with native seeds? Is there any?
I think so. There are other ways typically to trigger the plant to do that though.
Okay.
Native seeds and a lot of other seeds, and we think about it with native seeds because they're complicated, but a lot of other seeds do this interesting stuff too, where it's like you have to nick the outer cell coat to get water in. Sometimes you have to expose them to fire or even smoky compounds, right? So for our fire adapted plants. And so there's all sorts of interesting ways to do that. So I bet you could do that by hitting them with gibberellin at the right period. But like typically the way we're trying to do it is by an environmental cue that then makes that gibberellin situation happen.
Okay.
Good question. So abscisic acid, we'll talk about the stomata more in a minute. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
What is the apical dominance and the senescence?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and so like botany is gonna be like just a bear for this. So like please, when you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, just do that. That's really, really helpful. So apical dominance is, I'm standing like this because now I'm imagining myself as a tree. Naturally, right? That's what this posture is. Right, so if this is the top of the tree or the top of the branch and there's a growth point there, right? There's like a growth tip there, and then you have these side branches, right? This one at the top, that bud or node or growth point at the top, we call that the apical meristem, and it has apical dominance. What it's doing is it's actually mildly suppressing the growth of all the little buds down the tree or down the branch, because it doesn't want the whole thing to explode. This one wants to keep growing and elongating, right? Like imagine a tree getting taller or a branch getting longer. And so it suppresses growth, so it's able to get longer without all these exploding, but the moment you cut it off, right? Like another example is if you've ever pruned a basil by topping it, everything pushes out really quickly. And it's because this apical dominance has been removed. So apical dominance is just that suppression of the side branches. And then all the side branches rush, and typically once they're the furthest up, they start getting one of them starts getting apical dominance again. Right, and then it kind of slowly suppresses everything underneath. And senescence, was that the other one? Yeah, so senescence is like aging and kind of going into dying, right? So, but typically it's more like aging. So, really what you're trying to do there is you're trying to keep the plant going, right? So some of these plants, they just kind of go until some like natural event kills them. It's not like they age out, right? So that would be more like in long-lived perennials and trees. Yeah.
I just have a question, maybe related back to the last hormone. Can you say that again? Or the leaf fall or whatever. What would be going on like after fall? All the leaves are off most of the trees, but yet you might have one oak that has all these dead leaves clinging to it.
Yeah, so and birches do that as well a lot of the times. They hold their leaves. There's a number of species that hold their leaves. They just don't get that abscission layer the way that other species do. Right? So some do it very clearly, all the leaves drop. If you think about a birch, some oaks, they don't form that abscission layer right where the leaf, like this is now a leaf.
Right. Right.
They don't form that abscission layer right there, and so it holds on.
Okay.
But then what happens is kind of through the weathering of the year, they start breaking off, and then as the new leaves push out, they typically kind of jostle the old ones off or push them off.
I'm just very curious about that, especially after reading all this.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like, I would kind of, like, impress upon you too about a lot of this, is that sometimes there's an adaptive evolutionary reason why something happens, right? Like, it's good for the plant that it does or doesn't do something. Sometimes it just works that way. There's no adaptive evolutionary reason. Like, not everything out in the world actually has an adaptive evolutionary reason. There's a whole bunch of other reasons things can exist. Or it might even be that, the plant is doing something that's good for it over here that means it can't do this. So if you're just looking at, well, why doesn't this happen? You're not going to be able to find the reason easily here unless you understand. You know what I mean? There's all these really complicated relationships happening within the plant. So I'm saying that because like in my heart, I think we all want to look at things and be like, it's doing that because it's adapted, and it's like, maybe. Like, we are not adapted to have back pain, but many of us do, right? The reason we have back pain is because we started out walking on 4, and then when you come upright, you get all sorts of benefits, but one of the bad parts of it is now your structure was kind of evolved for all 4, and you're just trying to force it onto 2, right? And so there are some things that will come about as problems just because the thing you got was better, but now you have a little problem too. Okay, so roots, moving on to some specific structures. The real function for a lot of roots is actually anchoring the plant, just getting it to stay where it's supposed to be, not fall over. They absorb water and minerals. We'll talk more about that a little bit in the soils talk, but that's very, very important, obviously. They can help store food for the winter. So when we think about a lot of our perennials and trees, right, they're pulling a lot of their resources actually back down into their root system for the winter. They support the stem, and again, they grow by adding cells to the root tip or the meristem, right? So as much as we think about apical dominance typically on branches or on the tip of the plant, there are root meristems as well. So the tip of the root is the same way. And this is actually what a meristem is. This is really cool. So you have root, this is like a root tip, right? And this is kind of the very, very, very tippy tip of the root. It's the technical term. That's the meristem tissue. And the meristem tissue is actually, it's a collection of really interesting stem cells, basically, that can become almost anything, and they keep the plant growing. And so they keep the plant growing by always adding to the end, right? And so as the new cells get added, these will be meristem, and then these will slowly become kind of regular root tissue. And so that meristem is always getting pushed out. And so that's really where the growth is happening. The places that you'll see meristems also is you'll see them again, you'll see them at nodes, you'll see them at the tip of basically any structure, of like any branch structure. Yes?
So if you cut the tip of a root, will it produce more side branching on the root structure?
Yeah, so if I cut right here, I'll be honest with you, I don't know. If I cut in the meristem, I'm not 100% sure what would happen, because I think it might be able to basically remake itself. But if I cut here, there were probably nodes laid down all along this root, just the same way there would be on branches, and they'll start exploding out. And then you'll kind of get the same system happening below ground that you would expect above. Yeah. That's why, like, when you plant a plant, oftentimes, if you get like a root-bound tomato or something, you know, and you kind of give it a good jigsaw and you rip it apart, that's to encourage all that growth because you're breaking all those connections. Yeah.
Would that be related to like root pruning?
Yeah. Yeah, so root pruning, kind of. The other reason you often do root pruning is when you take a shovel and you're marching around the plant that you want to work with and you kind of are lopping off roots. There are 2 reasons to do that. One, well, there's probably multiple reasons to do that. And let me know if I'm talking about something entirely different from what you're talking about. One reason to do that is if you're trying to get the plant smaller, right? Like we think about like bonsai. You're going to take those roots back in. The other time you can do it is when you want to transplant a plant. And so you go through and you first root prune it. You go through and you do all that whacking with the shovel around it. Let it heal, kind of let it come back to itself a little bit, and then bring it up. And do that transplant. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I just meant like if you said there were likely nodes on the meristem that would support that, right? Because then
Yeah.
it could bush out.
Yeah. So you're gonna see like nodes all the way back up this thing, right? And it's gonna come back from that pruning. Yeah. Another cool thing about roots. This is a fun story. The science is a little bit out on like kind of where this exactly lands. But their roots often have all these relationships with fungi and other things. You might have heard these mycorrhizae, and extends the reach of the roots, right? So what's going on here is you have this tree, it's got all these roots, and the roots are actually connecting up with the fungal mycorrhizae, right? These fungal structures. And the reason this happens is because the roots are actually giving off sugars and carbohydrates. They're getting those into the soil, kind of just sloughing them off. And then the fungus is eating those sugars and carbohydrates, and then in return, the fungus is kind of giving off water and minerals, making minerals more accessible for the plant, right? So they're both getting something out of this relationship. If we think about like this little pine seedling right here, the roots are extending about this far. All of this is just fungal relationships. right? So it really extends what that plant can access.
So that's a symbiotic
Yeah.
relationship.
Yes, symbiotic because they're both receiving something
Yeah.
good from it. There is sometimes talk you'll see of something called the wood wide web, or kind of, which is like a cute term. You understand why I took off, about how the mycorrhizae from one plant might bridge to another plant, right? And so all of a sudden now you might be getting communication across these structures. There's some research to support this. There's also some kind of questions about like how it actually works, how much benefit it's actually providing. But this is kind of a cool new realm. I think people got really excited about it for a while, and they're like, "It's definitely happening. The trees are talking." And then people were like, going back to the primary literature, it's not clear that the trees are talking. But it's cool and it's interesting, and there definitely probably are connections here. We just kind of don't know what value they're providing to those plants. All right, so for stems, some of the major functions are again structural support of buds, leaves, and flowers, and then transport, right? So again, this is where your vascular tissue is. It's in the roots, it's in the stems, and they're transporting all these nutrients. And so we'll talk about this more in the next slide, but to kind of orient you here, right, you have your stem, you have your leaf, and then this is going to be typically a place where you have a supporting node, right? And this one has started to leaf out a little bit already, but this is meristematic tissue again, it's meristem. So the meristematic tissue is where buds and new growth comes from, right? So because plants can't just randomly add cells wherever they want, right? Plant cells don't move. What they do is as that meristem is elongating, it's dropping basically little populations of stem cells along whatever the structure is, the root or the stem, for later, right? It's an insurance policy for later. Maybe it's going to be something, or maybe it's just your backup plan, right? So here you would have had, imagine that root picture we saw of the root meristem, just turn it over, right? So now all of a sudden the meristem's growing up. The stem cells were elongating this, and then right here, they dropped a bud. Right here, they dropped a bud. If you look at any twig, typically you can find where these buds are, and that is a new, smaller population of stem cells that can emerge later. Oftentimes it just emerges into a leaf or a flower, but it could become a new branch. Right, so if I cut this plant off right here, if I just topped it, I've removed apical dominance, right? I've removed the meristem that's here. So now these little buds are going to start fighting to be the new leader, like if we were thinking about a tree. They're going to start fighting to be the next top, right? So this one will start growing and this one will start growing. This one, because it's a little bit higher up, is probably going to win. It's going to get far enough up that all of a sudden it starts releasing chemicals to basically suppress everything below it. Often when you're pruning, you want to cut just above the node. If you're pruning something like a shrub or a tree where the structure really matters, I would look at where that node's pointing, and I'm typically trying to cut right above a node that's pointing out. If you cut right above a node that's pointing in toward the center of the plant, you have now encouraged growth right into the center of the plant, which oftentimes we don't want because too many branches in the middle can get kind of muggy, and in our humidity it's no good. For cuttings, so if I'm just pruning, a cut here. If I'm taking a cutting to try and propagate, right, to try and get a new plant to grow, the cool thing about this node is it's stem cells. It can be whatever it wants to be, within reason. But it can be branches or it can be roots. So for pruning I go here, but for cutting I go here. Because I want this, I'm going to pull off that leaf, I'm going to dip that rooting hormone, and that's me taking advantage of plant hormones, right, to say, you're a root now. And a good number of times I'll be like, sure, I'm a root now, right? We have a whole class on propagation, don't you worry. So this is what that meristem looks like at the tip, right? This is our little stem cell population, and these are nodes that it's laying down. And so those are new little stem cell populations. And so this is a way of basically staining the cells of a plant, right? Like a researcher was able to take a really thin cutting of the plant, and then they put a special dye on it that would really cling to the stem cell type cells. And if they dyed dark purple. Whereas everything else just kind of dyed this light blue color. So you're seeing cell outlines and that meristem highlighted. So internodes are really just the space between the nodes. Nodes are what's really important on plants. You'll look at that when you look at alternate and opposite, anything. But the internode can be influenced by any number of different things: light, fertility, genetics. Light is probably what we're most used to, right? If you've ever had a tomato plant go real leggy on you because it didn't have enough light, right? That's the internode getting really long because the plant's basically trying to stretch to where it wants to go. Fertility can oftentimes cause short internodes because the plant just doesn't have the resources, right, the nutrients to be able to grow more than that. I think it's always important to remember that all of this is influenced by genetics because it's not just, it can only grow so long, it can only stay so short, it can only do so much. The genetics matter, yeah.
So going back to the pruning concept, how is that different with a plant that has opposite leaves where there's theoretically equal advantage for nodes on either side of that stem?
Yeah, so, opposite leaves typically are gonna come in pairs like this, but then actually the next pair, up or down, will typically be, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I'm typically just trying to find the plane that gets me not directly into the middle. Like if this plane, that's the middle of the plant, and then this one is like this, I'd probably be going for this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry. I never remember until I started doing this that I'm like, I cannot do this without being the plant. Which I assume does not work for everyone, but sorry about that. So modified stems. There are a number of stems that like to act like they're roots, which is kind of fun, just to throw us off the trail. So stolons grow above the ground like runners, so strawberries, right? Like you know plants that are always, or a spider plant, right, where they're always just like trying to make a break for it. Rhizomes grow at or just below the ground. These are both actually stems, like they're derived from stem type tissue. That's something that would matter maybe to a biologist or a botanist. It might not matter to you. If you care to remember it, I think of as rhizomes as being roots, right? So R and R, it's like my flow and food thing. So I know that rhizomes are going to be just below the ground, whereas stolons are more like stems and they're just above the ground. But technically they're both types of stems. You also have bulbs, tubers, and corms. So these are all about energy storage, right? And so I don't think this slide is 100% right. A tuber is more of a root structure, that's like a potato. But bulbs and corms especially, when we think about like on irises, right? That's a modified specialized stem structure. And so finally for leaves, we know all that about this, right? Function is food production. That's what leaves are really for. They are all about photosynthesis. So they absorb sunlight, they produce energy. And one thing to remember that's kind of helpful with leaves is that because leaves are really all about food production, and food production happens in green tissues, right? That's where photosynthesis can happen. When you start having these variegated leaves, these plants can actually struggle a little bit, right? Because this leaf has less green than it could. It has less photosynthetic ability than it could, right? And so a lot of times these plants will grow a little bit more slowly, which is fine. Like, they're beautiful, you know, sometimes you make trades. But oftentimes, they need more time, they need a little bit more love. A lot of times these white tissues are also a little bit more sensitive to sun. They can kind of burn and scorch because they're not protected by anything, right? They're not protected by green, they're not protected by red. It's actually a very protective color. They're just white, they're just out there. I say that out loud and I'm like, I have a high affinity for that. Because like, as someone who's very pale, like if you just put me out there without any covering, right, like we all know what's gonna happen. And so the minor covering they do have, and that all leaves have, is cuticle. And so this is composed of a waxy substance. Some plants have basically none of this, but you know, especially the waxy leaf plants, you'll see it. It helps repel water, it protects from dehydration, helps protect from disease, right? It helps keep fungi and to some degree insects out. The amount of it typically increases with sunlight. So this is true, plants can grow differently in response to sun conditions, right? They can get a thicker cuticle. Some of them will also start having their leaves turn kind of a reddish or purplish color. because that's also like their sunblock. And it's usually thicker on evergreens. You still there? Alright, so up until now, we have been thinking about really kind of more this end. And we're gonna really kind of switch gears and start thinking about gymnosperms and angiosperms. Right? This is the like vast majority of plants you're gonna interact with, and I would argue this is the vast majority of plants you're gonna interact with, flowering plants. But it's helpful to kind of think about these. So these are fun, and like we all love a fern. Some of us truly love a moss. Laura is our moss queen, if you ever want to look at that. But most of the time, we're kind of thinking over in here. So thinking about the seed-bearing plants, we start with the gymnosperms. These are going to be, some of the first ones are going to be the conifers, which are going to be cone-bearing with needle-like leaves, right? Like I think a lot of us are familiar with like conceptually what a conifer is. The cycads, which will be things like sago palm, and also the ginkgo. Ginkgo is really fascinating because ginkgo has basically no other close living relatives. It's considered a living fossil, but like again, that's like the term primitive, which you're like, it's been here the whole time. It's how rude to call someone a living fossil. And one of the cool things about it is that it does have these structures that look like fruits or berries, but they're not. They are not, because it's not a flowering plant, and only flowering plants can have fruits and berries. So you'll see this happen sometimes on some of the gymnosperms, where they evolve things that looks like fruits and berries, but to a botanist, they're like, no, that's a totally different tissue because it's developed from a different process. A few are deciduous, like bald cypress and ginkgo. If anyone is like familiar with the way a ginkgo drops their leaves, they go a brilliant yellow, and then in one day they just drop everything, which is really fun because it just rains ginkgo leaves for like a day. Bald cypress, if you work the office enough, you'll start getting calls every fall about someone whose evergreen is dying. It's just a bald cypress, right? Like it's just doing this thing. They drop their needles. That's fine, right? So there are some of these that are really helpful to know because it's like, no, it's fine. There are different types of leaves within the conifers, within the needle-bearing plants, and so we have, scales, which you might see this, right? That's that really kind of flat needly structure. Straight-up needles will have more of an awl shape on the juniper. These are all just botanical terms, and again, remember for botany, what I'm asking you to remember here is that there are differences, and when you look closely, they look different, and that might be useful for knowing, right? So if I saw a shape like this versus a shape like this, that would at least be notable to me when I was trying to diagnose what that plant was, right? I certainly wouldn't say either of them are leaves, right? Like, I'd be like, that's something else. It's like a needle, or if I was not feeling good that day, a flat needle, right? And even those sort of kind of really coarse terms can be helpful for plant ID.
But these are just types of leaves though, right? They're still leaves.
Yeah, they are, yeah. Yes, that's a great point. And so, sorry, let me orient to like how I'm thinking about that. When you're searching online for what something is, a lot of times after you've gone through the botany class, you'll like sit down and you'll want to be like just spewing botany terms into the search bar, right? You'll be like, it's stoloniferous, umbellate, serrate leaf, opposite, and like Google doesn't care, right? Like Google doesn't care about any of that, right? Like the term leaves, remember how to use these things as a normal person would, right? And so like a normal like this is definitely a leaf, but like an average person, if you were like, what is that? They'd be like, a needle. You know? And so I would search for that then, be like needles, cones. I'd probably get in there and I'd start counting how many little needles were in the bundle because that tells me something. And so that's why I'm saying like the needle leaf distinction is they absolutely are all leaves. But when you actually start trying to search for this stuff, if you use your botany terms in the Google search bar, you're not going to get that far, right? Like when I'm searching for things, a lot of times it's like small bug, yellowback, North Carolina, EDU, because I'm trying to find an extension source, and that'll pull it up, right? Like that'll get me a lot further than, yeah. Any of the coleoptera. Okay, so moving into another huge group of seed-bearing plants. This is the angiosperms. This is when you get flowers, the flowering plants. Really, really helpful to remember that flowering doesn't have to mean you see the flower. right? So your big lawn of grass out front, those are all flowering plants, right? Grass is half flower, you just don't see them typically. So, huge number of plants in this group. They're divided into the monocots and the dicots. The monocots, these are again the ones we think of as slightly more ancestral, but whatever, it's not a big deal. One seed leaf, when they emerge, they have one little leaf that comes out of the seed, right? It almost just looks like a stalk. This is grasses, including corn, lilies, orchids, palms, all of those are these types of plants. This is in contrast to the dicots, which emerge with two seed leaves, right? So when you're growing a little tomato plant or a little bean or almost anything else like that, and it comes up and two little funny little leaves come out, right? That's a dicot. Beans, marigolds, most plants, almost everything. It's worth noting that these two leaves that come out in the very beginning, we call them cotyledon or seed leaves. They're not normal leaves. They often look very different from normal leaves. They're just kind of the plant doing its best on its first attempt, you know? And then it kind of grows more of a normal leaf, a true leaf later. Throughout this, you also see that once the plant gets growing and once it kind of gets going, it's setting up that structure like we've been covering right throughout this first section, where you have buds, which are going to be undeveloped shoots. They can be either vegetative or flowering. They're kind of that resting state. So if you go out and look at a lot of your plants right now, they're covered in buds. For some of the things that are about to bloom a little bit sooner, the buds might be getting fat, right? They might be starting to think about it, but they're not quite out yet. The way you can typically tell the difference between a flowering bud and a leaf bud is flower buds do tend to be kind of fat from the very start, right? They tend to be a little bit thicker, a little bit rounder. Whereas leaf buds, this is the leaf bud right here, will be a lot sharper. They'll be thinner typically. Yeah.
We were talking about the meristematic tissue.
Yeah.
But in the sense of size, how, looking at that, like where is the meristematic tissue versus where does growth happen? Like how big is that?
Tiny.
Like
It's tiny,
a millimeter or?
Yeah, so like what I'll show you on this one, this is actually really helpful. So this is a bud, and so it's gonna be a leaf.
Yeah.
And so there's probably actually even a tiny position right here where there might be additional meristematic tissue that can get going. This is gonna have a tiny bit here. But so this is internode, this is a node down here again, right? See that little scar?
Yeah.
Basically? Right in the middle of that little scar, there is probably the tiniest amount of meristematic tissue still. So that if I cut this thing here, I've lost my leaf, but there's enough meristematic tissue there that I can probably get another branch to come. Tiny.
Tiny.
Yeah. So we often think of the primary buds or the primary meristem, right, as being those ones that are causing us our apical dominance, but most plants can produce buds if the primary buds are killed or removed, right? And that's because that little stem cell meristematic tissue is hanging out in these tiny places, basically at the nodes. So, you know, if you go through and you truly decimate the plant, you've removed all the tips, but it will start sprouting from everywhere else, right? It'll often come back, yeah.
Can we just go back to some like basic terminology?
Yes. Love that.
Adventitious, like that word was also used to describe roots
Yeah.
that come from like stem
Yeah.
cells or like, so what does adventitious mean?
Yeah, so adventitious roots, I don't know exactly what adventitious means, but I'll tell you what an adventitious root is, if that helps. Adventitious roots are gonna be the ones that start coming up basically, right from here. Adventitious stem, well, I think adventitious stems more. This is fun. Okay, so adventitious, typically, I think of that term being applied when you have a lot of growth happening, and then you have roots or stems kind of exploding out from places you wouldn't expect, right? So if I've got a bunch of adventitious like stems out here, I would be getting a whole bunch of little stems coming up right here from the roots, right? So you have these roots coming out, and then the stems start growing up, almost like from the roots. It's typically a stress response, Cause it's like this plant got walloped really hard, right? And it's like, I don't know what's happening, but I gotta grow everywhere because like these people are coming for me, right? So it starts setting up these little adventitious shoots, is what I think of them normally. That word just came to me. It starts sending all of those out. So I'll look it up and I'll get back with you. But typically I think of adventitious as being like, it's kind of exploding in a way that I wouldn't expect. If we're growing normally, yeah.
I think of it like, I always think it back to like germs. So like if it's an adventitious virus, it's like something that's gonna take advantage of the opportunity. Like if there's like space, they're gonna take it. Like it's like almost aggressive, or like something that's like just something that will take advantage of the opportunity. Is what I think.
That's a great, thank you. Thank you for throwing me that lifeline.
So are you, what we refer to as like suckers,
Yep, that's another term.
Okay, alright.
And that's the fun thing is, right, like oftentimes you'll have your botanical term and then you'll have your like other term, right? So like an adventitious shoot or a sucker. Sometimes you'll hear them called water roots too.
Yeah.
Right, like you hear these kind of multiple terms that like, for you looking at them are gonna feel really similar in what you're seeing, right? We just like to keep you on your toes.
But then don't like some plants like orchids.
Yeah.
They're tissues that grow out above the bark or wherever, those are considered adventitious too, aren't they? So
Oh, it's all coming
I'm
together for me, yeah.
a little confused because I had a rosemary plant that I brought to somebody that had all this weirdness going on the stems. And someone used that word, they thought it might be adventitious tissue. But I was like, or roots or buds, and I don't know, I'm still not convinced that was what was going on.
Yeah, okay. This is, sorry, you guys, sometimes it takes me a minute to get there. Okay. This plant is wallowed. It is stressed. It is trying to come back from that. Shoots start coming up from out here, almost like in the root structure, where they start exploding out from the base. We would call those adventitious stems, adventitious shoots. I have a tomato plant, or an orchid, that all of a sudden is starting to put roots out on stem tissue. Oftentimes this happens with tomato plants because you have such high humidity, and it starts sending those out along that stem. Those are adventitious roots, right? This is shoots or stems coming where I don't expect them. That's roots coming where I don't expect them. And we know that it's all just this kind of, opportunistic, aggressive growth, right? But it's a tissue where you wouldn't expect it, opportunistic growth, because of what's going on with it, right? And again, that's because when you think about those stem cell populations, right, that can become root or shoot. If I can trick a root node or a shoot node into becoming root by putting rooting hormone on it, there's an environmental condition that can do it too, right? Alright, I like that we crowdsourced that answer. Okay. Oh, yeah, this is very important. A lot of conifers do not have adventitious buds. So if you go in and you cut this conifer really hard, right, like if you cut all those lower branches out and you think it'll like just grow back in, it won't. Past the point where you see green growth on that stem, there are probably not nodes down here that can still grow out. So if you cut down into brown wood where there's no green growth, it's not growing back.
So just in terms of classification, the fact that the conifers are unable to do that is the ability to have adventitious parts. Adventitious parts, is that just characteristic of angiosperms and not gymnosperms?
No, because a ginkgo could do it, and a ginkgo is a gymnosperm. It's just a conifer weirdness.
Okay.
It's just a thing that when you're pruning a plant with needle leaves or scale leaves, I would really take a step back and think about what I was doing before I got in there hard. And we typically don't prune those that very much. We allow them to have their natural form. And it's because when you do try to prune them, it gets weird fast. Yeah, and it doesn't grow back. You can't save yourself with next year's growth. Yeah.
So then what happened, because as they're growing, they obviously put down these nodes, do they then reabsorb those stem cells back in and use them in some way, or?
I don't think so. I think they probably just basically die out
Okay.
or lose that capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Magnolias some, if you cut the lower trunk, never grow back,
Yeah,
but some do, right?
yeah. Yes, yeah, and so this is not to say that only conifers have this problem, but be very aware of this on conifers. So there certainly are some other plants that are not gonna grow back well from cuts, but conifers as a group, I would be careful with pruning them. And I would wanna have a plan for what I was doing.
So with this, like, I think of like an overgrown hedge or something, if someone has, in front of their house, where it's like, it's all bottom half, it's like 50 years old or something.
Yeah.
You would not be able to rejuvenate that by cutting it to the base usually. You would want to replace those plants,
Not on a conifer.
if they are conifers, right?
If you were feeling really like optimistic and you knew what you were doing, I mean, I'd wanna look into the specific case a little bit. You could certainly cut it down, but if it didn't come back the next year, I wouldn't be like, oh, that was
Surprise,
I wouldn't be shocked. I'd be like, oh. Okay, all right. I'm gonna keep it rolling because we have a little bit of ground to cover. Actually, though, do we need like a 5-minute stretch? Yes, I'm seeing a yes. If I got one yes, I'm into it. All right, we're gonna take a 5-minute stretch, and then when we come back, we're gonna hit this a little bit less questioning.
I have a one-on-one questions for you. I'm coming. Come on.